I'll pick 5. I'll pick 5 that are different than the ones that I had you submit.
Oh.
Let's make this as difficult as possible.
Will I have to read it to you storybook style?
I mean, that is kind of what you do with the Codex reviews, so.
Well, fair. Welcome to Preferred Enemies, the Warhammer 40k podcast that knows that character counts. I'm your host, Rob.
Kevin.
Dennis.
And Richard.
And we are talking character today because we have a little something special. It's funny because last episode we said, hey, we're done with codexes. What are we going to talk about? There's no new products on the horizon for us to come up with. We'll have to come up with new topics. And then DK Books reached out to us and said, hey, by the way, we've got the new Warhammer 40k Character Encyclopedia coming out. Would you like a copy to look at and review and talk about? And we're like, well, yeah, we would. And so we tried to figure out, like, well, we don't want to just do like a full, like a read through of the whole Character Encyclopedia because that would be kind of silly. It's 200 pages of characters.
I mean, then we'd be an audiobook, not a podcast.
Exactly.
And it's an encyclopedia, so like it's not exactly, there's no narrative throughput.
No, there isn't. So we put our heads together and we decided, well, let's talk about characters. And we'll start off talking about the characters, the rules of characters, especially named characters throughout the history of 40k from the very first rule book of Rogue Trader in 1987 to today. Which also made me realize that in 2 years, Warhammer 40k is going to be 40 years old.
And
yep.
Which I imagine is going to be a year full of crazy like product reveals and celebrations and such. Which
Doom Rider back. Guarantee, calling it now.
Which means they should wait a year to put out a new edition and release the new edition on the 40th anniversary. Just saying.
They should. They should. They will not.
Will they? We don't know.
No, yeah, they will not.
So, and because like I ran some wording through the rep from DK Books and they said they were totally fine with it. So I'm now presenting to you Preferred Enemies presents the history of special characters in Warhammer 40k, brought to you by DK Books, the Warhammer 40,000 Character Encyclopedia.
Woohoo! Yo, dog, I heard you like doing book reviews, so we gave you a book to another book to review.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not wrong.
Yeah. That's what we do.
Yeah. Among other things, but but first, before we get into some of the contents of the book, so what we're going to do in this episode is part 1 is going to be the history of character rules, and not so much we're not going to go through like every character profile or anything like that. No, this is about the rules that surround characters, kind of like we did a retrospective on vehicles several episodes back. We are doing kind of a retrospective on the rules around characters from the beginning of 40k until now. And then in part 2 of the episode, we're going to dig into the Character Encyclopedia and talk about some of our favorite characters from the book. And there's a surprising number of characters in here, but we'll get to that. Like part 2 will be kind of the book review, but I will say this book is actually chock full of characters that I did not expect to see in here. I mean, a lot that I did, but there were some surprises, which was good to see. But to take it from the beginning, first edition, 1987, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. The very first edition of the game, and one that is only somewhat recognizable as 40k as we know it today. It is a very different beast. It is just recognizable to be confusing. But back in the Rogue Trader era, this was much more of a, like, it was a tactical battle game, but it also had a lot of role-playing aspects to it. The characters had full role-playing stats, similar to what you see in like Horus Heresy 3.0, where there's a lot more stats for like leadership and intelligence and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But characters weren't even necessarily referred to as characters. They are referred to as personalities, and that those represented individual characters you could bring into a force. And they served a very, very different role. Basically, they were kind of special characters. They existed to basically lend their leadership and special war gear to a unit they were attached to. They didn't necessarily start attached to a unit. They could move up to a unit, specifically move up to the sergeant. Every unit had to have a sergeant equivalent in this game. They could move up to the sergeant, get base to base with a sergeant, and if their leadership was equal or greater than the leadership of the unit, they could take it over. And they would take over command of the unit. But once they joined into that unit, they were stuck with that unit for the rest of the game.
Look at me. I'm the sergeant now.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Now, the rule book had character profiles, and these were like for generic characters because it was very much a build your own character. And in fact, there's even rules for rolling up a random stat line for a character, which I thought was interesting. Something you would never see in a stock 40K product now. But there were no named characters. There were characters that are mentioned in like the fluff section, like the famous Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau and other such characters. Lehman Russ is mentioned, but he's just an Imperial general. Although he does get mentioned as a Primarch of the Space Wolves in a later Rogue Trader compendium article, which was the compendiums were just articles taken from White Dwarf at the time.
It is amazing how fast that initial iteration of the fluff changed, because what we would think of the Warhammer as the Warhammer universe now, like almost functionally doesn't exist at that point. Like there's some things that are spot on the same, and there's other things that are completely different. The Eye of Terror was completely different. Chaos wasn't a thing. Like full stop, just wasn't a thing in Rogue Trader. A year later, it would be like. It's wild how fast that stuff changed.
Well, to be fair, that's also why this is just considered Rogue Trader in 40K, and second edition is kind of like where it finally became Warhammer 40K.
Yeah, kind of crystallized into what it is. Yeah, because between 1987 and 1993, when the second edition comes out, they also have the Horus Heresy board game, which they had to come up with an excuse of why the Red Marines are fighting the Blue Marines. And so they're like, they came up with the idea of the heresy, which they spelled out a bit more in the Realms of Chaos books, but it was very much in flux and development. It was shifting all the time, which was really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, I think it shows why there's no special characters too, because it's so in flux and there's no, the world hadn't solidified yet into like these characters are important or it was much more open world, much more RPG, D&D inspired in Rogue Trader.
Mm-hmm. Now, they did start to add named characters that were playable. And there was a book called The Book of the Astronomicon, which came out a year later, 1988. And in that book, there are named characters, like 2 named characters for like each of the Arbites, the Mechanicus, the Administratum, assassins. They actually had named particular assassins, a couple of Inquisitors, Navigators, and Rogue Traders. Now, these characters, they had names and they had profiles and bios, but they're not like the characters we have now where they have all these like special abilities that they lend to the army. They had a bio, they had stat lines, and they had equipment. They might have equipment that you wouldn't normally have access to, but that's all they were. It was like kind of like a basic D&D character from back in the day. What is a fighter? A fighter is a stat line and the equipment he has. Mm-hmm. It was that very much that model. In White Dwarf, they started having the Index Astartes articles and other articles that added to Rogue Trader. And in White Dwarf 97, back in 1988, we first saw named characters introduced for the Ultramarines. Because I was doing my research on this and like, okay, so I'm looking for books. When was Ilya Nastase, the half Eldar chief librarian of the Ultramarines, introduced? And that was in White Dwarf, which... Interestingly enough, that White Dwarf article did not make it into the 2 Rogue Trader compilation books they later released. So that was
really
I was
they
surprised
decided to hide their heresy.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But I would say the idea of named characters was not seen as a core aspect of the game at this point. I think it was still very much a make your own characters, tell your own story. These side characters should only show up if it's narratively applicable to your game. because again, this was more role playing, it was more roll your own thing. And yeah, neither of the Rogue Trader compilations, which included rules for like doing Eldar armies and Gene Stealer cult armies and more Imperial Guard rules and Space Wolves were spelled out in there, but also no characters. They mentioned Lehman Russ as the Primarch. There's like a little two-page spread of art and narrative on him, but there's no stat line. There's no stat line for any of the characters. It's just units. So obviously at this point, characters were seen as like a historical thing, but you're not playing history. You're playing your campaign. So named characters weren't really that much of a thing in Rogue Trader.
Well, I think a big part of it too is like Games Workshop of the 80s and Games Workshop of the 90s are two completely different companies. Like, it was privately owned. It wasn't publicly traded. It wasn't like a company. It was just a little bespoke, RPG company, tabletop thing. So the demands of like wanting to control the IP and do other things with it were not there until it shifted around the time of second edition. They simplified the game. They focused more on brand management, corporate things like that, and like going public. So just the incentives were different. Like there wasn't the desire to control the 40K story and lore and brand the same way there is now, because now there's books and video games and regular books that get put out, Character Encyclopedia books and all these things that animations, all the stuff that they are trying to manage, and you can still, the space is still there to tell your own stories, but it fits within the GW meta narrative.
Well, the other thing I'll say about it is also back then, the units you use maybe use like 3-4 units. So you
it was really a much smaller game.
You didn't have space for all the characters because, you're going to put a character everywhere. Then it's kind of a character story rather than kind of a skirmish army battle story.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And also, even considering White Dwarf, back in the early days of White Dwarf, and I'm not exactly sure when in the history this changed, but I would say kind of around this period, they were still kind of publishing things for other games, like other game companies' games. Citadel started out as a separate mini line. And, this is when like the original like Rogue Trader plastic kits were available, like the original little Land Raiders and Rhinos, things like that. There was still a lot of D&D content being published in the mid 80s. Early and mid 80s for White Dwarf, like the Fiend folio from D&D was made from White Dwarf articles. Like that, those were all White Dwarf monster submissions. So yeah, the company was very different back then. And kind of, since Dennis, you brought it up, as they moved into second edition, we definitely see the game change. This is the edition when you and I were brought into the game originally.
Yep, at a convention in college.
Wow, you guys are old.
We are very old. Yeah. And this is also when we first see special characters being introduced. And characters in general had different rules, but they kind of followed the same stat line. You had, and this was very much akin to Warhammer Fantasy, where everything was done like you had so many points to spend, and you could spend up to a percentage of them on heroes, which would be your characters. Some of those characters were standalone characters. Some were like champions that would be automatically attached to units. And for the most part, again, you kind of rolled your own characters. But once the codexes started coming out for second edition, we saw special characters introduced. And they're mentioned a little bit in the rule book, but special characters became their own thing in second edition with the release of the various codexes. And it was interesting to see there are still a couple of things that are reminiscent of where from back then that are kind of reflected in some characters we see now. For example, there were characters who had to be your commander, which, like, when you built your army in second edition, you had to pick one model, one character to be your commander. And some of the named characters would have to be your commander. For example, Abaddon the Despoiler. Your Chaos Force may be led by Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos. If Abaddon is included in the force, he must be its commander. So, much akin, or very similar to how he is today. It's like, if he's leading your army, if he's in your army, he has to be in charge. And also, it's interesting how the characters were spelled out. because they had their base cost and then the cost for their war gear, but they always were equipped with their full war gear. So Abaddon is 150 points, but his war gear makes him 275. And it's like, so for example, he has the Talon of Horus and the Chaos Terminator armor and the Demon Sword Dracnian. I mean, Abaddon is really locked into who he is at this point.
Right. Yeah, he's always been who he was.
Right. He has all 4 marks of chaos. And also, I think it was interesting, most characters had some abilities. Sometimes they were just war gear, but sometimes they had special abilities worked in. Abaddon is primarily just a meat body that has some really nasty weaponry. Mm-hmm. He has like all the various marks. He can be accompanied by a unit of Terminators as a bodyguard. He can deep strike into battle, teleport. They didn't have the name Deep Strike yet. But then you get to a character like Karn, who's also in the Chaos Codex. He does have a little bit of war gear, but he also has rewards that are included in there. So Praise of Khorne is a reward he has, which is 20 points, but he has to take it because that's just how he's built. That would allow him to reroll any failed armor saving throw. So just reroll armor saves. And also, he was interesting that if you included him in your army, he had to be an Exalted Chaos champion. But if you ran 1,000 points or less, he could be your commander if it was entirely Khorne Berserkers and Demons. So hey, Khorne Demonkin back in the day.
Hell yeah.
Characters were also different back then in that, unlike today, when you pick a character to be joined to a unit, like when you're building your force, and technically it's like before the deployment step of the game, but we assign characters to particular units, usually during army building. In 2nd edition, and something that would continue on for several editions afterwards, characters could freely move between units. Like they were not pinned down to units. And they say in the rulebook, this represents characters, moving to where the action is, moving to shore up and shore up their troops. From a very thematic reason, you could move your character around to particular units and then provide their special abilities, their leadership, etc., to those units. They didn't necessarily grant those units their abilities, and we don't see that up until really today. But this is also when we first see the term Hero Hammer thrown around, because it was such a big change from the 1st edition, when you would have characters who could be larger than life, who could be loaded with, and whether they were bespoke characters you made yourself or whether they were characters, named characters from the codexes, you could build just some absolute monster characters and they could dominate the battlefield. It gets worse later on. But for right now, single heroes were still pretty powerful.
And I think part of it is like talking about like some of the changes in like the company and the business model impacted that, because trying to make the game much more mass market, and it was still played at, relatively smaller point levels, like smaller skirmish style. It's easier to convince people to be like, hey, buy a box of Space Marines and buy Marnius Calgar, and boom, you have an army. You only have to buy 2 things or 3 things. You buy this takes a chunk of your points. Oh, and he's really good on the table. So like the incentive structure was there to make characters good to get people to buy them, because, you show up to go to the store and it's like, well, I can spend $10, $15, whatever it was at the time, on a blister pack and get a character that takes up a third of my army. And then, yeah, I'll spend, $30, whatever, and buy the plastic monies and fill it out. But it really incentivized that kind of Hero Hammer. And they did the same thing in this era of Warhammer Fantasy as well, where, trying to sell people on those big centerpiece models and those useful characters, because, it just made more economic sense for them to sell it that way.
Mm-hmm. And that edition lasted for 5 years. And then in 1998, we moved to 3rd edition. And this was a rules rewrite, the core elements of which would carry us until almost 20 years later. Because 2017 is when 8th edition came out and completely did the rewrite. From 3rd edition through 7th edition, a lot of the rules for 40K were kind of locked in. There were definitely changes, and there were definitely changes with characters, and we will talk about that edition by edition, because it was in flux every few years.
But you could, in theory, play games of 7th edition with 3rd edition codexes, and it for the most part worked. Like,
yeah, it could. Yeah, it did function. You might not have all the bells and whistles and some of the abilities and universal rules, but yeah, like, well, considering like Dark Eldar, aka Drukhari, they were running on a 3rd edition codex until late 5th edition.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a decade or more.
Yeah. Long time.
It was a long time. Characters in this edition did, they could still move around from unit to unit. You also had a very early version of Lone Operative, which I was surprised to see in the 3rd edition rulebook. Characters were not able to be targeted if they were within 6 inches of another friendly unit, or they weren't the closest model within 12 inches. So characters were pretty much immune from anything but close-up fire, which I found interesting. It's obviously not universal today. If a character gets separated from the pack, he can easily be picked off if he doesn't have Lone Op, but that was a thing. When they joined units, they did not confer any of their rules to units. This is specifically called out in the rule book. And again, unlike today, when you have a character with a unit, they kind of share abilities in many ways. That was not a thing in 3rd edition. And again, pretty much forward until 10th edition. Also, a rule was introduced in 3rd edition that also carried over and was really rough on characters for a while. And that was the instant death rule. This was not specific to special characters, but it is very important for characters in general. If a character ever got hit by an attack that was twice where the strength was twice their toughness or higher, and they got hit, they just died. And in many cases, they couldn't make armor saves against those attacks either. It would just eliminate them off the board. So if you tag a Space Marine captain with a las cannon, he's just gone unless he has an invulnerable save. Now, when it gets to named characters, to special characters, this is when things got kind of interesting. And I'm going to compare and contrast the Chaos Codex from 2nd edition to the 3rd edition one, which is considered by many to be the high watermark of, well, no, not the first one, the second one, the 3.5. The first one did have characters. Yeah. The first one did have characters. Yeah, because it did have Abaddon and Karn the Betrayer and Fabius Bile and Armon. These were all characters who were in the 2nd edition codex. It also added Doom Rider and Cypher. Yeah. One of which we never saw again, and one of which has turned up like a bad penny from time to time.
In a bunch of different codexes.
But regardless, in both of these, we see something mentioned for special named characters that we don't see on any other characters, that we don't see any other data sheets. And this is what makes 3rd edition very interesting. So, for example, we talked about Abaddon, who, again, he has a retinue that he can take. He's an independent character, so he can move around from unit to unit. If he has a retinue attached, he can't join other units because he's basically got a bodyguard unit, much like we do today. He has Terminator armor. He has the Talon of Horus. He has the Demon Sword Dracnian. That's all pretty much the same, although the stats and the way the rules work are different because it's a different edition. But the important thing is this. A Chaos Space Marine army of 2,000 points or more may be led by Abaddon. If you decide to take him, then he counts as one of the HQ choices for your army. He must be used exactly as described below and may not be given any extra equipment from the Chaos Armory. In addition, he may only be used in a battle where both players have agreed to use special characters. Those two things, a point limitation on when you can take him, and you have to agree with your opponent that it's okay to use named characters, is so different than how the game is approached today.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing point limits for, like, you can't take the Lion unless you have at least 2,000 points, or you can't take Guilliman, Bobby G, unless you have that many. That would like make them stand out, because at 1,000 points, those guys just wreck things. Mm-hmm. And would they really show up to that small of a thing anyway? On the flip side, I like playing it. On the flip side, I like playing 1,000 points, and so I would love to use those models, but I do acknowledge that they get work done at that low point level.
Oh, they absolutely do.
It reminds me of the, I think it was 5th edition or whatever, where like Tyranids got like a second detachment at 2,000 points. So all of the events were like, we're going to run our events at 1,999 points plus 1. And it's like, come on, guys. you sometimes would have to like do shuffling to make some of that stuff work, some of those restrictions work.
Right. And 2,000 points was not a universal like threshold for you can only include a named character for at 2,000 points. Typhus, who was introduced in the 3.5 Chaos Codex, which that is the high water mark of Chaos design.
Yeah.
He could only be included as a Chaos Lord at a 1,500 point army. And I think that's an important thing to point out, because also at this time, 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, 1,500 points was like standard game size.
Yep.
So Abaddon didn't see the table much unless you were playing a big game.
Mm-hmm.
But you might see Typhus, and 1,500 points, he was 230 points. He was a huge chunk of your army, so he better be worth taking. And a lot of times these characters were good, but they also tended to be thematic more than super powerful. And you also had restrictions on the army that you could take him in, because yes, you could take Typhus, but you were probably going to be taking Typhus in a Nurgle themed army, which you had to pay for all your troops to have the mark of Nurgle added. Chaos themed units were more expensive, so he would be in a more expensive army by definition. And armies back then were also just smaller. Like even 1,500 points, it wasn't that much, honestly. The boards are flooded these days compared to what standard game sizes were in third, fourth, and even 5th edition.
Yep.
But yeah, 3rd edition, characters could still move around. But yeah, it's just that you can only take named characters if your opponent agrees to it also, which generally you did. Like there were very few instances. And I think that also shows the difference in how the game is approached in the late 90s and early 2000s compared to today. It's not to say that Warhammer 40,000 tournaments didn't happen, but this was not seen as primarily a tournament game. This was not seen as a primarily competitive game. It was not built around competitive play. And it would not be built around competitive play until relatively recently.
Yeah, well, and like back then, it was kind of an extension, like you said. It started out as an RPG, put on the tabletop, and they're still kind of moving into the tabletop side of things, but it still has some of that RPG feel, especially like buying all the war gear for the characters.
Yeah. Now we move forward 6 years. 3rd edition sticks around for 6 years, and in 2004, the 4th edition of the game comes out. I came into the game at the tail end of 4th edition, but in 4th edition, requiring permission to play named characters had pretty much gone away. In 4th edition codexes, you do not see that term, but you do still see point restrictions. So, for example, looking at the Imperial Guard Codex, if you want to take Ursarkar Creed, you had to have a 1,500 point army. Okay, fine. But if you wanted to take Commissar Yarrick, that's a 2,000 point army. So those restrictions still existed. I believe Tau armies required 1,500 points to take Farsight or Shadow Sun at the time as well. Like,
yeah, I think it was 1,500.
Yeah,
because I remember that it was special when I got to play him.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, 1,500 was pretty much the standard size, but there were a lot of 1,000 point games being played as well. So again, named characters were seen as kind of unique and special, a little bit more thematic to build around, especially like Farsight, where you wanted to build a big unit of like crisis suits around him to use as a bodyguard because he had special rules for that. In 4th edition, which 4th edition was kind of a tune-up of 3rd edition, there were rules changes, especially regarding things like sweeping advances and close combat. That's for another day when we get to the history of assault in the game. Mm-hmm. But for characters, the targeting was revised. There was no longer that kind of lookout sir style being within, like if you were within so many inches of a unit, you couldn't be targeted. Now, characters could only be targeted if they were the closest model. It wasn't closest model within 12 inches. Character had to be right up on you. If there was something else closer, you could not target a character. Also, they had the independent character rule like formalized. This is 4th edition is when we see universal special rules really introduced to the game in a significant way. And the independent character rule was built around characters, whether they were named or more generic, who could move around from unit to unit. Independent characters could not join a unit with other characters. They could join like blobs of infantry, but you could not have two independent characters running around together. This changed 4 years later in 5th edition when the rest of us came into the game. And 5th edition made a couple of big changes as codexes came out. First off, those point restrictions on characters are gone from 5th edition codexes. You do not see them at all. It's like, if you want to take Abaddon at a 1,000-point game, good on ya. They also made a couple of new rules that really changed how people approached characters. First off, we mentioned that instant death rule, and instant death carried over from edition to edition up through and including 7th. But a new rule was added that not all named characters had, but a good number of them did, and that was Eternal Warrior. And that a unit with Eternal Warrior was immune to instant death. You could still be wounded as normal, but you could not just auto die to it.
This was something that for Eldar you had to have, because Eldar toughness 3. Even strong guns were at least strength 6. So instant death was just killing all their named characters, especially the Phoenix Lords, especially in lore, say, oh, well, when they die, they come back. So it seemed thematically fitting for them to have that, and mechanically fitting because Eldar characters were just getting shot off the table.
Absolutely. No, my eternal frustration for this edition was that Karn did not have Eternal Warrior, and he would always be incentivized to run him into like some big target, and if he didn't kill them first, they would swing back and insta kill him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I played during this edition, I played Orcs and Tyranids, and there was 0 Eternal Warrior among those factions.
Yeah, it was not a rule that was distributed evenly. Some armies had more access to it than others. Chaos Demons, everything had Eternal Warrior, which was supposed to represent the fact that they weren't actually made of flesh. They were just warp stuff. And then, you mentioned the Phoenix Lords, Dennis. They all had Eternal Warrior, but a lot of armies had no Eternal Warrior. There was very little to no Eternal Warrior in the Imperial Guard Codex or the Tau Codex. It's like, I mean, you were grateful that Tau Crisis Suits were toughness 5, but if you got tagged by like a Demolisher Cannon or Las Cannon, you still just died. It was still rough. The other change to independent characters, and again, pretty much all named characters were independent characters. In this case, they removed the restriction, said they couldn't join other characters, and in fact, they specifically call out in the rules they can join other independent characters and make a super unit, and that's when Super Friends armies became really popular, and they sucked to play against.
Except for the Phoenix Lords, because they were too expensive to do that with, and even then, they didn't synergize greatly.
No, they didn't. No. But some armies had characters that did synergize really, really well. And even with generic characters that you could have like a librarian and a captain and a like basically make a super command squad running around as just like a Death Star.
And I think shortly after that, or maybe it'd be an edition after that, they made the command units where you had like the banner holder and all these guys who were kind of character-esque in one unit.
Yeah, they would get rolled into a command squad, and it's like maybe, in some cases you could not break them out anymore. So 5th edition was a very different beast when it came to characters. 6th edition, even more so. 4 years later, in 2012, 6th edition, we still had Super Friends units. This was still a thing. And again, characters could still move around freely and rejoin other units. So you could have characters like bodyguarded in units and then have them break out and form a Super Friend. Or you could make a Death Star of a unit and as many independent characters as you could add to it to basically take wounds. However, because that was becoming a thing in 5th edition, 6th edition came up with a couple of ways to try to deal with it. First off, they added the concept of precision hits, which are very similar to precision today. In this case, 6s to hit, and there were shots and strikes, but it worked the same way. If you rolled a natural 6 to hit, you could pick out the models in a unit you wanted to target. And so that was one way you could target characters. However, there was a counterpoint to that, and that was Lookout Sir got added. And so if you had a character who was within 6 inches of another friendly unit of infantry, usually, then if they got hit with an attack and they were dealt damage, you could roll a die, and on a 4-up, those wounds went to the unit instead. And if you were an independent character, you passed Lookout Sir on a 2-up. So it was still very hard to stick wounds to a character, but it was theoretically possible. And I want to say sniper weapons allowed you to beat Lookout Sir.
I remember there were some ways to get around it, so that would make sense, like a Vindicare rifle or something.
I also remember that, like, the way precision was worded was very weird in that you had a rule called precision that gave your attacks, like, precision hits when they rolled a 6. But then there were certain guns that had just precision hits on all of their hits, and they still called them precision hits, so it was kind of hard to differentiate the two.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think I'll go ahead and speak for the entire group here. I think everybody can agree that 6th edition was the best, most balanced, most clear edition of the game that's ever existed, right? It was so perfect. That's why they had to replace it less than 2 years later.
Yep.
And we haven't even gotten to my least favorite rule of 6th edition yet.
Oh, we will.
Yeah, we're about to. I'm seeing the rundown. This is foreshadowing.
Yeah.
You know, I have to call you out a little bit, Kevin. I think your issue with that rule was more with the chaos rule that went along with it.
Oh, for sure, but it still sucked.
Right.
Okay, so precision shots. If any of your character shots roll 6 to hit, these are precision shots. Sniper weapons. If a weapon has sniper special rule or is fired by a model with a sniper special rule, each to hit roll of a 6 results in a precision shot. That's the same thing. Oh, but also they did mention snapshots and shots from a weapon that scatter or do not roll to hit can never be precision shots. So I don't know if that means you could snapshot a sniper rifle and just like 360 no scope somebody, but the big thing on sniper weapons is they auto wounded on 4s. Like they didn't care about the toughness.
Oh, that's
against,
right. They were
against
like
non-vehicles.
Yeah.
And they were pinning and rending. So, but now we're going to get to probably your least favorite rule. Yeah. And that is challenges. So challenges were seen as a way to try to, I guess, break out the Super Friends a little bit. And that's if you had 2 units that had characters in them, and that included sergeants, like just upgrade characters. They could, like those 2 units, the character in one unit in the unit charging or attacking could declare a challenge to the defending unit, and the character in the defending unit could choose to accept or deny the challenge. If they denied the challenge, they didn't get to contribute to the fight, if I remember right.
Yeah, because the challenge fight happened separately. So if for example, Karn with his like 60 attacks or whatever he had in this edition goes into a unit of Terminators and the sergeant says, I will accept this challenge. I kill the sergeant with, his 1 wound or whatever. Those other like 30 wounds I would have done, hey, just go away. Just lost. That guy's super dead. Nothing else is impacted.
Yeah. Now, if you accepted the challenge, you had to move the 2 models to base. They could only apply their wounds to each other. And the surrounding group of models, like the outside forces, the outside models, could not put their wounds on the characters because that would be interrupting the challenge. So instead, for every 5 models on your side that were in your unit but were not contributing, you got rerolls. Like you get one reroll to hit for every 5.
I had blocked that part out. I had blocked that memory. Such a dumb rule. Such a dumb system. It basically was the high school. It was basically that like middle school, like circle of kids watching somebody fight. Like it's dumb. It's dumb. It's a bad system. Made worse by the fact that, as Richard pointed out, Chaos had to issue challenges. So you had no way to avoid this crap.
Right.
Continuing GW's trend of, what if we made Chaos exactly like the Imperium, but worse in every way?
And they even mentioned like, oh yeah, combatant slain. If one of the two combatants in the challenge is killed, it's not considered complete until that until the end of the phase, regardless of which. So it's like, yeah, you're still stuck in that challenge. So yeah, Karn would just be beating on the dead body until the next phase of combat.
I mean, that is the most Karn thing ever, but still.
Yeah. Something else I didn't have on my notes here, but something that did also come up in 6th edition that did impact characters and often did impact special characters was the edition where warlord traits were introduced, which is not a thing we really have. I mean, they've been lumped in with enhancements now in 10th edition, but 6th edition was what introduced warlord traits, and special characters might have specific warlord traits assigned to them, but the rule says if they don't, you would just roll a random warlord trait, because this was back in the days when you didn't get to pick one. You rolled up your warlord trait.
Again, 6th edition really was the perfect edition of this game.
So 2 years later, we get 7th edition. And again, all these things that we've had so far, independent characters moving around and forming like Super Friends units, and precision shots and lookouts are all in here. Now, we did have a couple of changes. One thing that characters did whenever they join a unit, and this goes back all the way to like 2nd edition, is they lend their leadership. So they would help with morale. Also, the morale system was very different than what we have now. Very different. In 7th edition, and from 3rd to 7th edition, if your unit failed morale, they started running away. They ran off the table until they would start running towards the table edge. And if they ever moved off the table edge, they were just gone. In 7th edition, they also had the rule that if a unit was below 25% of its starting strength, it could only reform. You had leadership was a roll low system in that day. So like you would have a leadership of 7, you would have to roll 7 or less. If a unit was below 25% starting strength, you had to roll double ones. You had to roll snake eyes to get them to regroup, because they were so broken at that point. They were not going to band together unless something amazing happened. If they had a character attached, if they had an independent character attached, then they only needed to roll a normal morale check if they were below 25%. So that would be one reason to have a character join a unit, was like, this unit I cannot have this unit break. And if they do manage to break, or if I can move somebody into the breaking unit, I might be able to recover them. So that was one thing characters could do in this edition they had not been able to do before. They also did change challenges in 7th edition. They got rid of, and this is probably why you blanked it from your mind, they got rid of that whole outside models providing rerolls.
Because that was the issue. That was the problem with challenges.
Right.
Glad they fixed it. Glad they fixed it.
Also, but they did say outside models could not apply wounds to the characters in the challenge unless there were no other models remaining. Yeah. So in that case, it like Karn is working, I believe in 7th edition, Karn could probably still apply wounds outside the challenge once the challenger was dead. And the unit Berserkers use with, if they killed the other unit that was challenging, they could then apply wounds to whoever Karn was fighting. Yeah.
Which is much more sensible.
Yeah. Now, 7th edition had a lot of other flaws, but they weren't generally tied that much to the core rules. They were more tied to all the army building that was done around the 7th edition core rules. So in 8th edition, we saw a sea change. For the first time since 3rd edition, a complete, from the ground up rewrite of the rules. Some basic, mechanics stayed the same, as far as characters still had a stock weapon skill and ballistic skill. You still had strength and toughness and, things like that. The wounding system was revised a little bit, but characters got a massive change. First off, independent characters were not a thing. All characters were technically independent, so independent they could not join units. So this introduced the era of Warhammer, because you brought characters for one of two reasons. Either they were combat monsters in their own right, and they could stand on their own, or they provided a useful bubble of buff to units around them. But because characters could not join units, they had to put in rules to keep characters from just getting picked off the board. And so characters with less than 10 wounds, so 9 or less, could only be targeted if they were the closest enemy model. So we're kind of getting back to the 4th edition style targeting of this. Characters can only be targeted if they are the closest model. The reason they put in the less than 10 wounds is because monsters, so monstrous creatures like the Swarm Lord or Hive Tyrant, were also characters, but because they would have more wounds than that, they could be picked off. Because again, it sucks to be a Tyranid player sometimes.
Yeah.
This was also the era of game, the edition that gave us heroic interventions, which we still see today as a stratagem, but in 8th edition, it was just a thing that characters could do. If an enemy unit had charged and had moved within 3 inches of a character, and the character was not in the unit charged, then they could automatically move in 3 inches in the enemy's charge phase. And so you could have a combat character shadowing or tailing one of your friendly units. It would be providing, kind of screening for him. And then, oh, look, somebody charging that unit. Now I can bring the character in to swing.
Yeah, that was super helpful because since they couldn't join the unit themselves, they weren't completely trailing behind and like had the ability to still join the fight. They should have just let them join the units. Like that's honestly skipping ahead a bit. That's one of my favorite parts of 10th edition is that you could just put them back in units and it makes all of it simpler.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a solid rule for what they were trying.
Right. But you also did end up with weirdness, and we saw this even more in 9th edition of like having multiple characters stacking up auras.
Mm-hmm.
8th edition and 9th edition are good rule sets, but there's some weirdness that results from that design of having characters just kind of floating on their own. And it also became obvious some characters were really not meant to just be out there on their own. There were characters who were definitely should have been allowed to stick in. You had to deal with things like commissars being units that kind of followed around in, infantry units and would have a bubble of, I will kill one of you to make you re-roll a battle shock test. And of course, in 8th and 9th edition, battle shock tests cause damage if you failed them. So you were deciding, am I going to take more damage if I roll badly versus taking the 1 damage from this commissar who's following me around? And 9th edition is just a revision of 8th edition. The biggest change for characters there, which still function the same way, was the change of the Lookout Sir rule, which was they codified it again as Lookout Sir, so kind of calling it back from 6th edition. And this was changing the targeting again. So if a character was the closest target, you could absolutely target it. If they weren't and they had less than 9 wounds or less, then they could not be targeted if they were within 3 inches of a monster or vehicle with 10 or more wounds, a unit that contained 1 or more vehicles or monsters, or a unit that contained 3 or more models. So basically, if the character was next to a big threat or had infantry that was nearby, or a unit of monsters or vehicles that were smaller than 10 but also still a unit, it's weirdly worded in 9th edition on those two.
And the reason they were trying to stop this is because what people were doing in 8th edition is they were taking the mandatory like small characters, and rather than the intent of running them near a unit for their bubble, they would just go off and run off in a corner and hold an objective, and you'd win the game because your apothecary is just sitting on an objective all game, scoring points. So trying to like incentivize them to say that, no, you have to be near a unit to get the Lookout Sir or something like that. Like trying to get people to use the units the way they're supposed to be, meant to be used in the fluff. The easiest answer is just have them join the unit.
Right. And also, something in 8th and 9th edition, this was also when we saw factions and sub-factions with their own warlord traits and codexes with sets of warlord traits and special characters. We've kind of just gone to generic character rules, but special characters, if they were your warlord, they would have a specific warlord trait, usually from the list of warlord traits your codex already had anyway. So they didn't necessarily do anything you couldn't do with a generic character as far as warlord traits go, but it definitely shaped which way your army was built. If that character was your warlord, not all characters had to be your warlord.
Yeah.
But like if this character is your warlord, or if you had multiple named characters, you had to pick one to be your warlord, and that would determine what warlord trait you had. And special characters in 8th and 9th edition did not have access to relics. They couldn't, we already had, named characters couldn't be customized with war gear, but they also, we had relics that you got for free, which sometimes would be very good and broken, and sometimes they would do nothing. But named characters could not have that. So sometimes armies were better off not running named characters because you could build more broken combos with generic characters. I think 8th and 9th, we actually saw somewhat of a reduction of the number of named characters played, unless it really fit a particular army style, or they did something very cool.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the, getting like the warlord trait if you're the warlord, that neutered a lot of named characters because it's like, okay, we're going to take, Karn or whatever, and we're going to give him, I don't remember exactly what it is. We're going to give him one of his abilities that he just had before. Now that's his warlord trait. So if he's in an army with Abaddon or with someone else and he's not your warlord, you just don't get that. He's just not as good, So it kind of incentivized using more generic characters rather than the named characters in certain cases.
Mm-hmm. So like I said, unless the named character brought something to the table that was very special, you didn't see them as much necessarily.
Yeah.
And then we get to 2023 and 10th edition in our current edition, and we see the return of leaders joining units, which was very welcome to see. Now, they did put restrictions on what units a given character can join.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And that applies to both generic characters and named characters. I don't think that's necessarily bad. It just occasionally it can be frustrating because you may want to join a character to a unit and you just can't because it's not the right type of unit. So whether that's you're playing Tau and it's like, well, I would like to have an ethereal join to this like maybe join to a crisis suit unit to protect it. Nope, can't do that. I mean, he can't, even if he's on a hover drone and could move as fast as they are, he can't. If you want to join Fabius Bile to a unit of accursed cultists, you can't. He doesn't join those. He only joins chosen and legionaries. And there have been cases where it's like, oh, there are, like, I would like to join a generic canonist to Zephyrim. Well, you can't until we release one with a jetpack, and then you can. And that's a special character. And they've had to do those changes. Like, you couldn't attach canonesses to Retributor squads until, for the index period of 40K until they fixed that with their codex and they expanded the list of units that they could join.
You couldn't attach Gazgul to Orc Boys.
Yes, until like the balance date is late a month ago.
Yeah.
So it hasn't been perfect. It's been one of the things that I have I like the concept, but the execution is still occasionally clumsy.
Yeah.
But it's definitely better than Warhammer. And because with very few exceptions, you can't have multiple characters attached to a unit. You don't end up with the Super Friends issue that you did in 5th edition onward.
Yeah. I kind of get it because you start off kind of conservative to try and avoid the brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can kind of slowly kind of dial in and add in the few things that are maybe missing and won't be broken.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe when you get your third codex, you'll have a character that can join Terminators.
Hey.
Yeah.
Not bitter. Not bitter.
Not bitter at all. The other thing that leaders bring, besides you use the lowest leadership in the army, you use the best leadership in a particular unit, is leaders have leader abilities. Not all of them, looking at you, Lucius, but some of them do. Most of them do. And they will have abilities to say, when this model is leading a unit, models in this unit get an ability. Again, a pretty neat idea. It is occasionally frustrating when a character is built around, like, has this really cool ability, and then when their unit goes away, suddenly they don't have the ability anymore. And it's, for example, Morven Vol of the Sisters of Battle. If she's leading a unit, which she can only join Paragon Warsuits because she is riding in a Paragon Warsuit, so she can only join them. If her unit of Paragon Warsuits dies, she loses her ability, which is to reroll hits and wounds. So when she's leading a unit, they can the whole unit can reroll hits and wounds. The minute the last Paragon Warsuit dies, she forgets how to do that for herself. We've also had, like, hey, units, when this model is leading a unit, they get a feel no pain until the unit's gone, and then they don't anymore.
You also get, conversely, units that had rules that said when a character is leading them, they get a rule. And then if somebody like Precision snipes them out, then that rule goes away.
Yeah. So it's a mixed bag. It's 10th edition does a lot of things right with its characters, but it does occasionally, again, it's the implementation in particular cases. It's not a universally bad. It's just, there's occasions where it's just like, okay, yeah, this feels like it should be better, and it's not. But it's not terrible. I definitely see it as an improvement over 8th and 9th. I prefer characters being attached to units. I like having a restriction on how many characters can be in a unit. I'm glad that Super Friends units are gone. Like, Super Friends were a bad idea. And thematically, when you're building a force and you attach a character to it, it's like, this is his squad of things, or this is her squad of thing. Like, this makes sense. Like, this is their bodyguard. And they're referred to as bodyguards. So it gives that unit a bit of a special kind of narrative oomph, which might maybe encourages you to paint or customize those models differently, because you're going to always run them with that particular character. So, it's got some hobby implications as well. But yeah, in the last 38 years, the rules for characters have definitely been a bit of a roller coaster. And it doesn't help that there have been a ton of characters introduced in 40K from 2nd edition onward. Because let's be honest, most of the ones from 1st edition did not make the cut. I don't think.
Yeah.
I think Marnius Calgar might have been in the old, that White Dwarf issue, but
what about Sly Marbo? Was he in the original stuff?
No, it was an even more overt Sly Stallone reference. It was a different character with an even, like, it was something like Stone or something like that. I'd have to look it up real quick. But now, a lot of the Rogue Trader era characters, like, just didn't make it, or even a character like Lehman Russ, who was explicitly called out in the Rogue Trader rulebook. He's basically Logan Grimnar now. Like, basically, because in Rogue Trader, he was a Space Marine who's like the current leader of the chapter and stuff like that. And like, they've kind of like reallocated that name to the Primarch, and now Logan is effectively what that character used to be. So every character stuff from Rogue Trader is basically incorrect or changed.
Right.
Which is where the whole like everything is canon in 40K thing comes from, because there are so many old contradictions from Rogue Trader and those early White Dwarf articles that there is no way to reconcile it other than it's all made up.
Yeah, if you want great deep dives into the history of like certain codexes or the history of certain themes in 40K, a couple of great channels. Snipe and Wib are awesome. They're codex compliant episodes where they'll dig into an old codex and like, oh yeah, and this is what I liked back then, and yeah, this conflicted with something in the previous codex, but it was they do it in a very amusing and well documented style, often with the original materials as often as they can get their hands on them. Also, Olden Demon is really good for digging into like the history of Warhammer. He just did a video like a day or two ago, or just released a video about the most broken things in various editions of 40K from about like 2nd edition onward. So if you remember
Spoilers, it's mostly Eldar.
Actually, no. It's only Eldar like once or twice.
It's like Eldar like 2 or 3 times, but like three of the 6th editions he talks about are Eldar. But yes, there's also other stuff.
I was so happy to see the Kroot conga line make a comeback in that episode. But yeah, so those are great episodes. We are doing our best impersonation of both of those for this. But yeah, definitely check out Snipe and Wib and Olden Demon if you are wanting to dig more into the history of Warhammer. But it is time for us to take a break. We're going to go ahead and take a break for sponsor identification. When we come back, we're going to dig into the actual Character Encyclopedia and talk about some of our favorite characters from this book. Also, if you want to support the show, there's 3 great ways you can do that. First of all is our Patreon. We are at patreon.com/preferred enemies. And that gets you access to the Preferred Enemies Discord, where we've got a great community of people hanging out, having conversations, sharing hobby tips, talking about all sorts of topics. Also, you get access to any materials we make, such as our 10th edition update to the Urban Conquest mission pack. And it's just $1 a month. We don't lock any of our episodes behind a paywall, but if you put in $1 a month, and if enough people did put in $1 a month, it really does help out. So far, it keeps us income neutral. You pay for our web hosting and our recording services. You help us replace mics when needed. You help us. Eventually, we're hoping to start getting traveling again. So putting that in helps us offset the travel costs of doing things like sending Kevin and Dennis down to the Grand Narrative, which you guys will be going to in about a month. So
I have so much to paint.
It's a little over a month, so we have a little more time before panic time.
Yeah.
No, I'm in panic mode.
To be fair, I only have to get 9 models done. I've got all the rest done for the army. So,
Do you want to know how many of my Votan models I have completely finished right now?
0.
Yes, you
Yeah.
are correct.
I was gonna say, how many do you have primed?
They are all primed and they are all dry brushed to get ready to start applying the contrast.
Okay, nice.
But yeah, if you want to help support us, that's at patreon.com/preferred enemies. We really do appreciate any and all support. Second is on YouTube. We post our audio episodes as video versions on YouTube. We are at youtube.com/@preferred enemies. And just do the standard YouTube things like subscribe, like videos, subscribe, ask for notifications, comment, interact, anything that helps us pull our way through the algorithm. I know a lot of Warhammer 40K content creators have been having more and more trouble with getting, like dropping user counts and such. So, I know adding one more to the pile to split your attention between, but we do really appreciate the support there. Third is our merch store, preferredenemies.com/merch. You can buy hats, shirts, mugs, stickers. We've got a new design that we're working on that we should have up soon. And again, anything people want to buy and wear to rep the show out in public would be fantastic. So, as I said, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, it's time to dig into the Warhammer 40,000 Character Encyclopedia. See you in a bit.